Welcome back, everybody, for Season 2, Episode 6. Thanks again for joining me. We're going to take a little break this time around from the interviews and slow it up a bit because today we're going to be telling Brenda's story. I'm really excited about this one, perhaps in a bit of synchronistic destiny, I'm not sure, but not only does this one hail from my home state, one especially strange event in particular may have occurred just down the road from where I slept every night, so definitely enough to pique my interest. And to that point, it never ceases to amaze me just how commonplace this stuff is, despite the way pop culture has it all framed. The more research I do, the more it reinforces that these people that we keep playing the X-Files intro for whenever they tell their stories, they're not caricatures, guys. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, and they're just like us, only they have to carry around this burden of either shutting up about or trying to explain to others things we can't even explain, let alone comprehend. Brenda, for example, she has a good life. She's educated, has a career, she's a mother, a wife. Her life is not vastly different from many of our own, is my point. But we all have our little secrets. And some of the things Brenda harbors are things the world as a whole really isn't ready to hear yet. Individuals are different, yeah, but humanity in general, I think we can all agree, is on a more glacial scale. By now, as much as I wish everybody was receptive to and discerning of subjects like precognition, the paranormal, synchronicities, UFOs, and alien abductions, that's just not where we're at. Look no further than the headlines. If I didn't know any better, it's almost like we're regressing right now, and we got a lot of work to do, but this isn't that kind of show, and I'm sure you didn't come here for socio-political commentary. That said, we all have our little circles. We're usually okay being judged by to some degree, but we're not all in a position to attach our names to these things publicly. So to respect the privacy of those involved, I'm just going to be referring to everybody by first name only, but make no mistake, Brenda was extremely forthcoming and candid about her experiences. We had a good amount of back and forth, over the course of obtaining her story, and she was descriptive, articulate, and I think above all, sincere. She was even able to help me obtain a written statement from another person who, for all intents and purposes, appears to be a credible witness to something completely incredible. I think that really speaks to somebody who did experience things beyond the ordinary, who's just curious, like everybody else. Case in point, one of the very first things she asked was if I'd noticed any similarities among those who report this kind of stuff, and my answer was pretty much, yeah, I have. They're not crazy. To be clear, I've never attended med school, all right? I'm not qualified to make that diagnosis, but I think I know when a story or a person rings true and when one doesn't. And not only is this a very credible story, but it hit really close to home for me, and that's something I'm still processing, honestly, but I'm also excited about it because I have this unique opportunity here to analyze some of this stuff from a familiar place this time. That should allow me to maybe add a little more personal perspective, so really looking forward to this one. I hope you guys enjoy the show. Before we get to that, though, just quickly want to acknowledge a few recent ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. You guys know who you are, so thank you very much. That little minute of your time is an immense help. And so is pulling up your phone for just a few seconds to follow us on Spotify. Again, tiny investment of time, big difference. We also just started a brand new feed on Instagram. Make sure you're following ether_show. That is definitely where we're most active, and it's a fun feed. I think you guys will enjoy it. Comments are welcome and encouraged. You can message us on Facebook. Just look for the Ether Podcast. I always post show updates there for you as well. You can email theethershow@gmail.com. And if you have a story you'd like to share, I'd love to hear from you. I'll be back after this. Let's start with one of the more recent events from 2013. Brenda began her career working at Ramsey County Courthouse, part of a historic city hall located in downtown St. Paul, right off the Mississippi River. It's an impressive 21-story Art Deco-style high-rise that first opened in 1932, and the interior features the same zigzag kind of lines and architecture as the exterior. It's really classy. It's decked out with ornate bronze doors and carvings. There's a gold leaf mirror capping the 3-story marble atrium. The most dominant fixture on the first floor being the largest carved onyx figure in the world. Fun fact, it's a 36-foot tall, 60-ton statue depicting 5 Native Americans at the base surrounding a fire, each smoking their peace pipes, with a towering figure in the center representing our collective vision of peace. I found that kind of interesting. But Brenda's immediately in awe of this place. You know, it's gorgeous, it's intimidating, it has integrity, and it's really rich with history. She'll take the stairs just about every chance she can, just as an excuse to explore it, and she's mesmerized by the click that her heels make as they hit the marble floor. Part of her job is going to the basement of the courthouse 2 or 3 times a day to retrieve archived files, and pretty much right away she realizes something's off. Everything would always be perfectly fine as she made her way downstairs and through security, but every time she'd get to the archive room, she'd encounter this overwhelming sense of fear and dread and despair that would just permeate the space. She has to make her way through a windowless, nearly pitch black room underground housing all these archived files on either side just to make it to the light switch, and this routine is already starting to take its toll. By now, she's announcing her visit every time before she enters the archive room by saying, "I'm coming into your space, I'm only here for information, I'm not going to hurt you." And sure enough, the dark atmosphere of the room would then shift ever so slightly, but only just enough to tolerate it so she can basically get what she needs and get the hell out of there. In one particular day, it started out like any other. Still within her first month there, Brenda grabs her access badge and her list of files she needs from the archive. She takes the stairs as usual, marveling at the architecture and the satisfying sound of her heels on the marble. She makes her way through security into the archive room. She recites her lines and announces her visit as usual, but the place feels a little different today. It's more ominous, darker. She carefully makes her way through the dark room and over to the light, flips on the switch, but she glimpses a disheveled man sitting up against the wall. He's dirty and has his legs up against his chest. His head is down on his knees. He's only there for a second and vanishes. Brenda's not sure what she just saw. It could have been the light, maybe her imagination, but feeling a little more uneasy than usual, she repeats her previous line and says, "I'm not here to hurt you." She reaches out for the file divider and feels a quick, cold on her hand as all the skin on her arm fills with goosebumps, and she finally decides to go confide in a coworker about this room. But, as it turns out, a few strange encounters in the basement of the Ramsey County Courthouse. It's just another day at the office. In fact, they were kind of surprised it took her as long as it did to say something, because that particular space used to serve as the jail and execution area during the turn of the century. About as far back as Brenda can recall, she's had the ability to, in her words, sense when something else is there, referring to what most would probably consider spirit-type entities. She could never see it, but she always felt a strong presence in her mother's house. That all changed one night in 1994, about age 17. Brenda awakens at some point through the night to suddenly witness a 6-foot-tall, slender woman with black hair and a cameo brooch in her bedroom doorway. And she doesn't say anything. The figure just makes its way over to the foot of her bed and looks at her. This is the presence in that house, and Brenda's petrified. She can't move and she can't speak. And just like that, the figure's gone. Frozen in fear, it takes her several moments to sit up in her bed, and she finally rushes to go tell her mom what happened. Next day, Mom presents Brenda with a photo from the Historical Society of the previous resident, Lillian, and she's shown with her husband. They were the ones who actually built that property, and the woman in the photo is exactly who Brenda saw at her bedside the very night before. She insists even today that her presence in that house is so strong that she oftentimes can't enter her parents' bedroom or even go upstairs. It's just that palpable. And she describes this feeling like a paralyzing force that stops her dead in her tracks every time, the very moment she senses it. It's almost like somebody or something is drawing an invisible line saying that's far enough. And all Brenda can ever manage to do at that point is either turn around and go back the way she came from or pick another room, because entering that space is simply not an option. These aren't just random occurrences now and then. She claims she senses Lillian's presence in that house almost every single time she's in it. Now, before we get to the next story, the main attraction here, just a couple things about Brenda I think I should mention here. Aside from her sensitivity to other energies, she also appears to be able to foresee certain things and events before they happen. This occurs a few different ways. Quite frequently, she'll either notice some odd detail, or she'll spontaneously conjure up a random image, a name, a place, or something that doesn't really make sense at the time. But a day or two later, in one synchronistic form or fashion, these things always play themselves out in some real tangible way. For example, one day she sees a random flyer with an arbitrary date on it, still like a month away. She turns to her husband and says, "I hate June 14th. No reason really, she just kind of said it. Brenda ends up having an ultrasound on June 14th, where she learns about complications of her pregnancy. And she's told she'll have to be on bed rest for the next 14 and a half weeks. 3 years later, her son has his first seizure on June 14th. They had to put their family dog down on a different June 14th. Oftentimes these things, they reveal themselves in dreams. In a different example, many years ago, having recently developed a little crush on somebody, Brenda had a dream one night where she was with this person out in front of a church. She leans in to kiss him and he suddenly turns into her cousin. Kind of disturbing. The very next morning on a Sunday, she gets a text from the guy she intended to kiss that he met somebody the very night before. Coincidence? Well, maybe, but you got to think about it. This stuff happens all the time, and the precursors are always accurate. It's not like Brenda's seeing future events exactly how they play out. It's more like she's tapping into a realm that uses symbolism to communicate. And that sounds an awful lot to me like the same place where synchronicities come from. And I think we all have them. I know I've had a couple that have left me speechless. I think they are fascinating. And I also think some people not only experience more, but heightened levels of synchros. If you're not already caught up on this concept, Carl Jung first coined the term, referring to meaningful coincidences back in the 1920s. It's not hard to find information. Definitely check it out if you haven't. There's a lot of great books out there on it. I like to think of them like brief but intense and profound moments of clarity, but we'll be circling back to these in the insane ways they present themselves a bit later. Early into our conversation, Brenda also asked if I'd come across anything odd about people with Rh negative blood. Up until this episode, I'd heard it mentioned quite a few times, but I never dug into much of it. Well, I did, and I sort of found what I expected. You know, they're descendants of lizards, royalty, or alien races, interbreeding species with ultra-terrestrial types, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Definitely out there, but here's what we know about it. There is mystery surrounding Rh negative. Nobody really knows where it originated from or how, and why only 15% of us have it. Rh stands for rhesus, which, because we originally thought rhesus monkeys also possessed this unusual protein in their blood. We later found out that it was only similar, not exact. So there's really no definitive timeline or origin for this. There are rumors of health benefits, but nothing really proven. But there is one major downside, however. Mothers with Rh negative blood can have serious problems with pregnancy. If the father's Rh positive, this can wreak havoc on the fetus, and in many cases, the mother's own body will attack the child if their blood types are incompatible. There's a whole spectrum of outcomes from general complications to developmental issues, even death. As you probably guessed by now, Brenda is Rh negative, and she did experience multiple similar complications over the course of both of her pregnancies. Luckily, though, her children are both perfectly happy and healthy today. It's funny because she's admittedly not the type at all to entertain some of the outrageous claims that are out there, but she mentioned she saw an article about the blood type being not of this earth, and she'd meant to look into it and wondered if I'd come across anything supporting that. And of course, my answer was no. Even after some research, I don't see any compelling arguments backed up with anything more than speculation in terms of the origin of Rh negative. It's entertaining, but it's not very credible, I'm afraid. Perhaps a good indicator of what I'm talking about here, Google Rh negative blood origin. One of the first few hits is going to be Gaia.com. And look, if you want to spend your time and money subscribing to Gaia and learning all about Corey Goode and his secret missions to Mars, I'll try not to judge, but there's actually much better information out there. For example, Nick Redfern wrote a book, Bloodline of the Gods, back in 2015. He explored a lot of those theories. My knee-jerk reaction to the theories I've seen is no way. It's too fantastical, too tinfoil hat. However, if the next and final story I'm about to tell is true, I have no choice but to at least reconsider some of these theories. We don't have smoking gun proof, but there's enough here to temper my skepticism with some pause, despite how far-fetched these things may sound. About 6 or 7 months after seeing Lillian for the first time, this would have been about late January, early February of 1995. Brenda's almost 18. Her friend Mandy is 16 and pregnant. Mind you, this was long before MTV tried to make it cool, so it's a bit more taboo in 95. Anyways, Mandy still lives at home with her parents in Osceola, Wisconsin. Population at the time, maybe 2,000. It's a small town, so still likely under 3,000 people today. It sits just on the east side of the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin, the only thing separating the two being the St. Croix River, which is a 170-mile-long tributary of the mighty Mississippi. It runs along the border, but also stretches into far northwest Wisconsin. It's definitely an iconic landmark area for both states. I spent most of my life just a few miles from it. I can't tell you how many times I have crossed that river. It's very scenic and peaceful, and the temperature up there that time of year was actually a little unseasonably warm. It was highs in the upper 30s or lower 40s, and so that's still cold, but definitely not bad for the dead of winter up there in the frozen tundra. There's still likely a decent snow covering at the time. And the border towns all in this area are pretty much mostly very small. It's just forest, farmland, lakes, rivers, quaint little townships, each with their own watering holes. Some are rowdier than others, depending where you go. And there's not a lot of distance between cities and counties. 10 minutes in most directions takes you to one small town or another. And most folks around here, they know their neighbors. Of course, it's 1995, so the internet's barely even a rumor at this point. We're still actually going to libraries for information, believe it or not. Cordless phones, baggy jeans, and O.J. Simpson are all the rage. Michael Jordan is just about to come out of retirement. It's pre-9/11. President Clinton hasn't even begun his affair with Monica yet. Things today are a little different than they will be in 25 years. Life isn't necessarily easier, but perhaps simpler. And people in general are more trusting in nature. There's no Amber Alert, no Craigslist killers, no selfies, no memes, no social media platforms to grandstand on. We're a lot more innocent in some ways. As a fellow teenager myself in 95, I live about 30 miles northwest of Osceola at the time in another small town in neighboring Minnesota. Actually, if you take the St. Croix north from Osceola, it eventually curves up and over west before heading north again. At that little section, I'm about 10 miles west of the river, off of a road aptly named St. Croix Trail. Our balcony even faces due east directly toward it. Granted, I couldn't see the river itself from that distance, but perhaps I might have seen something else had I been looking that direction one night earlier that year. Again, it's about late January, early February, and most likely a Friday or Saturday evening, given that Brenda's staying at Mandy's parents', and because Brenda's boyfriend's over, these hangout sleepover things are usually a weekend affair. And Mandy's parents, they have an open door policy with all her friends. They're like family. They're kind of always welcome. And Brenda refers to it at one point like an orphanage for kids who had homes they didn't or couldn't go home to. They're actually in the middle of transitioning Mandy from her old room upstairs to the basement in preparation for the baby that's likely to be due in the next couple of months. But they all decide to crash upstairs in her old room for the night. And Brenda isn't the night owl type. She's actually the one asleep before everyone else. 9 p.m. or sooner isn't out of the question, and weekends are no exception. So it's likely around this time, as best she can recall, nearly 25 years later, that Brenda falls asleep normally, without issue. Her very next memory is being up in the air. She doesn't recall floating or how she got there, for that matter, but she estimates she's roughly 50 feet or so in the air, higher than a telephone pole, but lower than a plane on approach for a landing. She can see the streetlights of Osceola below, the familiar neighboring towns in the distance. She recognizes the shape of the river she's known since childhood, and she's heading west toward the road they would always take that leads to the interstate. She hears a soft, machine-like humming sound, but she can't identify it or what its purpose is. They cross the St. Croix River and continue in the same direction, no clue where she's heading at this point. Whatever's transporting Brenda travels maybe just a few short miles west, then lands in a field of a township just south of the small town of Schaefer, Minnesota. She steps down onto the ground, facing east toward the river. She can clearly see the water tower and the streetlights of Schaefer just to her left side. Brenda's spent her whole life in this general area, so she's familiar with the terrain. She knows exactly where they are. And I say they because after a few moments, Brenda, realizing she still hears that same humming sound she's been hearing the whole time, she turns and looks behind her to see what's producing this sound. It's then that she notices a very large craft hovering some distance above the ground. It's dark and difficult to tell what shape it is, but end to end it's about the length of a commercial plane or so, and it's emitting several different colors of brilliant, flashing, rotating lights, making it difficult for Brenda to make out any details, but she also sees a tall, slender silhouette of a figure in front of her. It's telling her it's time to go. She likens it to a parent calling for their child at a playground. Brenda's not afraid to go with this figure. In fact, she's quite comfortable around it. The presence is familiar. She describes it as a welcoming feeling, like she belongs with it. Unsure why she has to leave or where she's going next, Brenda abides and takes one last look around before getting back inside this enormous craft. She takes the same position as before, standing up inside of this thing. She looks out of a window at the ground whipping by below as it's traveling at a much faster speed now. They're heading north again, swiftly up the St. Croix Falls riverbed. Brenda can see the ground underneath them, just pulsating with this array of different colored, spinning, flashing lights this craft she's in is still generating, like a giant Christmas tree flying overhead. It's dark inside the craft, however. Brenda's not able to make out any details, but off to her left, she can see what appears to be a series of long hallways and walls. They continue to follow the river for some time, and Brenda estimates they go about as far as halfway between St. Croix Falls and Grantsburg, Wisconsin. So in other words, about 30 miles or so northwest of Osceola. Meanwhile, inside the craft, Brenda realizes the same silhouetted figure from earlier is standing close to her. She tries to see this entity. It appears to be humanoid, but it's too dark to make out much in detail. And Brenda asks, "Where am I going?" And almost as soon as she does, the craft then abruptly turns and starts heading in the opposite direction. Still following the river, they're now heading south. And Brenda's just watching the river fly by underneath them when she's urged to lean against a wall, so she does. The wall then tilts backwards until she's lying flat on her back, face up. Her almost parental-like companion that's been with her this whole time finally comes into view. It's a man or possibly a woman. It's hard to say because it's not from here. He or she has a large head. It's gray in color with green and bluish hues. Then she notices the almond-shaped eyes. It has the largest, darkest eyes Brenda's ever seen. Next thing she knows, she's back in Mandy's room in bed, terrified. In this state of confused horror, assuming she's just awoken from a nightmare, she wakes up her boyfriend Tom, who's lying right next to her, sound asleep. She tells him, "I've just had the scariest dream of my life, you have no idea." He tries to shrug it off, but she insists, "No, you don't understand, I was just abducted by aliens." He reassures her that she's okay. It can wait until morning. There's no boogeyman here, and it's just a dream. No one's here to hurt you. And Brenda takes a couple deep breaths, tries to settle herself when all of a sudden the room fills with bright flashing lights. And she's just about to lose it at this point. And it's all Tom can do to convince her it's only a snowplow. And that's enough of a possibility for her. And eventually Brenda's able to shake it off enough to be able to go back to sleep without further incident. Now, before we move on to the next part of this, I wanted to stop and make a couple of quick but important points here. Though Brenda was absolutely petrified in Mandy's room immediately following this experience, she makes it a point to reiterate that was not the case at all while she was with them indicating too she believes there was more than one being not of this earth aboard that craft with her. But remember, she said they felt familiar, welcoming, like they were her family. And we'll be coming back to that in just a bit. Another thing, a certain movie eventually dawned on me, Fire in the Sky. And that debuted in 93. It was still making a big enough impression on people by 95. The X-Files, that was only in its second season, I think, at that time. It was immensely popular. And I had to know, I asked if any of this stuff could have possibly been any kind of influence, and it doesn't sound like it. She's never seen Fire in the Sky, not to this day. In fact, not a fan of alien movies or even science fiction in general, for that matter. Ironically, not her genre. I want to also point out here that Brenda convinced herself at the time, or at least shortly thereafter, that this experience of hers was a dream. When I asked her more about this, she explained that at the time, it was pretty unfathomable, and besides, she didn't want the ridicule. She was almost 18, so not a good time to be labeled as crazy, different, or some kind of a freak. The only logical choice for her was to call it a dream. And it's not until years later that Brenda comes to the shocking realization that this may not have been a dream after all, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But there's this other problem. If it was a dream, why was it, first of all, the most vivid, hyper-realistic sensory overload dream she's ever had? Never had another like it. And second, why does she remember it all in such rich detail all these years later like it just happened yesterday? And that's not normal. Every other dream she's ever had has faded over time, but not this one. Perhaps Brenda put it best when she says, quote, "It was real to her, and that no dream has ever been more real than that experience." Fast forward now about 20 years, Brenda's at work, and she's being kind of silly with a coworker, not even sure how they approach the subject of odd experiences, but she actually confides in this coworker, someone who's not even a close friend of hers at this point, this alien dream she had. As Brenda tells her story, her coworker Jill's face grows paler as her eyes widen more and more with every sentence. She can even see her skin's covered in goosebumps now, and sensing something's up, Brenda asks her what's wrong. Jill then relates a story of looking out of her window one night when she was 16. Would have been late 94, early 95. She saw a bizarre display of lights in her backyard that sound eerily like the ones Brenda described. Jill lived in Schaefer, Minnesota. She was also kind enough to send me her written account of what she witnessed that night. They lived in a house on a 5-acre plot of land in Schaefer. The backyard was a large wooded area that they had fenced off for their 3 horses to roam the back area, but they had a clear open view of the south from their property. Jill's older sister had recently moved out, and she's already confiscated her old bedroom. She distinctly remembers that it also just snowed the night before, so there's this fresh, untouched, powdery coating covering the landscape. It's a beautiful thing, one of the perks of living up north. It's later in the evening, as best she can recall, roughly between the hours of 7 to 9 p.m. or so. Her mom's not home, so Jill's actually in the house by herself that night, just watching a show on TV in her newly acquired bedroom. She gets up to grab something to eat and walks down the hallway that opens up into the kitchen, where they have this patio/deck area with a good open view of the southern property. All the lights are off inside the house, so she has a good view when she notices bright lights in her backyard. She moves over to the sliding glass door for a better look, and in a small clearing of this wooded area out back, she sees what looks like circular-shaped, multicolored Christmas lights all moving and spinning around in circles. Jill isn't able to make out what this thing is exactly and decides to take a picture. She goes and finds her camera, which unfortunately has dead batteries, and she can't find any new ones around. She returns to the door to watch these lights again. However, each passing second, she feels more and more dread. And the thought of aliens landing in her backyard actually does cross her mind, and the thoughts only get worse. She starts thinking, what if they see me and come take me? So, not feeling very good about this situation anymore. Jill decides to go back to her bedroom, just hoping this thing will go away. After about another 30 minutes of trying to watch TV and forget about these lights, she goes back out to the kitchen. They're still there, right where she saw them before. She retreats once more to her room and finally draws enough courage after about another hour or so to peek out of the window. Whatever had been there before that created that light show and caused her so much unease is gone now. Jill's able to breathe a huge sigh of relief and go back to sleep without issue. Curious, she heads to this clearing where she saw these lights the night before to investigate, and the fresh coat of powdery snow was still perfectly undisturbed. No horses had made their way back there, no tracks, no landing marks. There was not a single structure around, no Christmas lights anywhere in sight. Jill even walks through the woods and over to her neighbor's house to make sure they didn't have any decorations or anything on display, and nothing. Between her home and their neighbors, there's nothing else around. Nobody was out riding a tractor with bright spinning lights in the pitch dark. It wasn't a plane or a helicopter, as it made no discernible noise. And this is rural Minnesota in the middle of winter, so it's dead quiet. She would have heard something. Considering the property and where the clearing is located, it would have been within 300 yards. Needless to say, this other potential witness gave Brenda something to think about. Her whole life, she felt comfortable enough calling it a dream, but Jill's story fits the time of year, the time of day, and the description of the object. What's more, I was curious if there was anything around this area that Brenda and Jill mapped out for me that maybe stands out or fits with other UFO sightings. And yeah, sure enough, there's a large quarry just west of the St. Croix River that sits exactly where they both described. What are the odds that there would be a significant deposit of quartzite, granite, and limestone right there? I've covered other stories about how the majority of people that disappear in the wilderness do so in areas with large granite deposits. The Falcon Lake encounter occurred over a large ore deposit in the Canadian wilderness. It's not uncommon to hear about UFO sightings in which these craft appear to be mining our natural resources. They've been reported to suck up water from lakes. They commonly scan and probe land and vegetation with these bizarre light beams. It's almost like they're transferring, collecting, or harnessing something from certain earthly elements. It's a lot of speculation there, but a large number of reports indicate at least some kind of connection to places like this. So how many does it take for these to no longer be coincidences? Well, let's add a few more. Just recently, within the last couple months, Brenda was out in this field showing her daughter where this took place in accordance to Jill's old house. They leave and go down the road just a short ways. Brenda sets her phone down and heads into a store. When she comes back out, who's calling her phone at that moment but Jill? Brenda laughs at the irony and tells her, yeah, I was just in that field with my daughter. Jill laughs and says, yeah, sorry, I just missed your call a couple of minutes ago. Only Brenda never called Jill, not even by accident. Brenda and her daughter were both inside the store without her phone, precisely when Jill received the missed call message. So who called Jill? And guess who else, out of the 15% of the population of humans that have it, possesses Rh negative blood? That's right, Jill does. On that note, Brenda's maiden name happens to date back to a long line of English royalty. Without revealing her identity here, even her real first name translates to something that goes right along with some of the incredible claims I came across regarding the origin of this blood type. Oh, and Jill's real name, it originates from the royal forest in English royalty, so you really cannot make this stuff up. I asked Brenda if she's ever seen another UFO, awake, asleep, and her answer was no. She's never had another experience like that. The only thing that might come close would be this spontaneous but fairly frequent intuition she seems to possess, almost like they're distantly related in some way, or maybe they somehow come from the same place. I'll be back after this final break, and we're going to dissect this one a little bit, so stay with me. big thank you to Brenda and Jill this week for sharing their stories with us. And thank you guys for hanging in there. August has really flown right by, and I just did not get to devote as much production time to the show as I usually like. But, it is summer. What do you do? I'm grateful I had the opportunity, though, to cover this one today. Obviously, it's so much more than just a ghost story or a UFO story, but I do want to spend some time here on this elephant in the room. Was the UFO experience a dream, or did it really happen? Well, what makes it more likely to have been a dream exactly? It's easier to explain, and for most people to believe, yes, but does that make it more likely? Let's review. Brenda had no reference for a dream like that. She has never seen a single movie or read one book in her life about gray aliens in UFOs abducting people. So where exactly did she conjure up all of this material that mirrors so many other UFO sightings and encounters to a T? Did she relive an old memory buried in her subconscious? A scary movie or something she saw as a kid? Maybe, but how did she know about the familial aspect? Abductees almost always report feeling at home with these beings, like they belong with them. They're comforting and welcoming, not frightening, at least not at the time. How do we explain the parent-child relationship she described with her companion? And that's her word, not mine. She chose companion, not captor, not kidnapper. If you're a longtime fan or researcher of UFO lore, you've heard these things before because they come up all the time. But I don't think somebody who's not even a fan of sci-fi would know to throw these things in for good measure. The way she talked about them was almost moving. I sensed that Brenda genuinely took comfort in thinking about whoever, whatever they are. Like this dream wasn't a dream at all. It was a reunion, and it won't be the last. If it was only a dream, again, why does she remember it so vividly? Of all the dreams, this is the one that stands as the most vivid, beyond realistic, intense one she's ever had. While every other dream fades over time, this one's as fresh as yesterday, even though it happened almost 25 years ago. How do we explain away Jill seeing the same kind of light display in her backyard, same time of year, same place, same time window? We can't prove Jill saw a UFO. It's possible she saw something more prosaic, but what then? It wasn't farm machinery. Too noisy, and nobody's operating equipment like that in the pitch blackness of night on rock-solid frozen ground in the middle of winter. Besides, whatever she saw was in her backyard, not out in some farmer's field nearby. It's 1995, so highly unlikely to be some kind of a drone. And what drone would have emitted such a huge, dazzling display of lights? Again, I think I'm going to go ahead and rule out a plane or a silent helicopter landing in her backyard for an hour and a half and then flying away without making a sound. Whatever it was, it frightened her enough to hide in her room from it for 90 minutes. And her 16-year-old imagination could have gotten carried away, yes, but I think Jill would have recognized something familiar or normal, but it wasn't. This thing didn't look right. It didn't belong there. And she observed these lights in the exact same place Brenda says she stepped out into the open field after landing. And Brenda was very clear about how the ground all around and below this craft lit up like crazy. We definitely shouldn't overlook that there's not just one, but several quarries nearby, rich in mineral deposits. I've seen this come up way too many times to ignore it. And as I said before, it's not just limited to the UFO reports. Plenty of strange things occur in and around these types of areas all the time, though we only have theories as to why. There has to be a good chance somebody else somewhere would have seen those lights that night, but how many of them would have seen them land in their own backyard in that time frame? Probably just one. And what are the odds Brenda's going to end up working side by side with this one particular witness who would also later go on to receive a mysterious missed call notification from Brenda just a moment after physically standing in that same clearing years later? What are the odds they'd both have Rh negative blood and that both of their names trace back to English royalty? I'm not saying they're lizard people, all right? I'm definitely not advocating any of those theories, but maybe there are some origins of truth in there somewhere. What about this area then? The border towns of Minnesota and Wisconsin along the St. Croix River, are they UFO hotspots? As it turns out, yes, they are. According just to New Fork's database, reports of cylinders, triangles, rectangles, saucers, and shape-shifting discs, unusual lights traveling up the St. Croix River, bright lights ejecting smaller projectiles at the ground, zigzagging lights and crafts over the interstate, mysterious high-speed objects, followed by military aircraft, just to name a few, are way more common in this area than I ever would have imagined and continue to occur today. But I truly had no idea, and I lived right next to it my whole life. And Brenda's account, look, I mean, on its own is extremely compelling. All the classic elements are already there. Then you add the witness. So I'll just level with you guys. It doesn't sound to me like Brenda's experience was just a dream. If we're leaning towards what's most likely here, having considered all things, is the dream theory still easier to explain and to believe? I'm not so sure that it is. And what do spirit beings, precognition, and synchronicities have to do with UFOs or their occupants? Maybe nothing. Maybe it's more about the individual and what they're capable of sensing or tapping into. In that case, what about Brenda is so different from the majority of us? What is she tapping into exactly? I still have a hard time entertaining the theories about Rh negative, but I also can't deny that it's rare and that both Brenda and Jill have it. Jill doesn't recall a UFO abduction, however, or another sighting for that matter. This doesn't automatically mean it didn't happen, but we have nothing to really support that theory in this case. Or maybe that's just another perfect example of the elaborate, absurd ways that synchronicities often present themselves to us. That's the show, guys. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Don't forget to head over to Apple Podcasts and Spotify to support this program if you haven't, and follow us on Instagram. Thanks again, everybody, for joining me in the ether. We'll see you next time.